Welcome to another edition of Technology and Things. I am joined today by John Carruthers, who has been on our program. He was actually our second guest, I think, and then he was a panelist. We did a security roundtable, and now he's actually a co-host. So I think next time you hear him on here, he'll be replacing me.
Yeah, I've come full circle. Very excited.
So super glad to have John Carruthers here to help me out with this discussion.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah.
Appreciate
Moudy Elbayadi and Neil Daswani are with us, and they wrote a book called Big Breaches. And when I got a copy of the book, I immediately thought of John Carruthers because I definitely need some help with this. This is some pretty heady stuff, and I knew he would be great. And so he's loaded with.
Yeah, I'm very excited to be here. Big breaches is kind of my thing, or it was my thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You dealt with some big breaches in your time.
Yeah, I was in the FBI, and in fact, that was when I was first on this podcast. It was as an FBI agent, if I recall correctly.
Yeah.
And now I work with you, Paul, and so.
You've really moved up in the world.
I don't know what happened, where I went sideways, but somehow, some way, I'm now with you.
Maybe, or I've moved up.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Yeah, that's that. We'll focus on that side.
Yeah.
But
But anyways, Neil and Moudy, thank you for joining us today. It's great to see you guys.
Thank you.
And thanks for
Pleasure
coming
to be
on.
here.
Yeah. So, we're gonna jump right into this. Moudy and Neil, I want to just get right to it. Why do we need another security book? I'm dying to know. I feel like there's a million books. What was it that you guys were sitting there around the table thinking there's something that we have that hasn't been touched on? Maybe you can give us a glimpse into that beginning of that book.
So I'd be happy to chime in on that. There are many security books out there. There's many security books that speak to security professionals. This book is the security book for non-security people, for the most part. So it tells the stories of many of the past breaches and provides advice on cybersecurity to everyone. And so that's I think, the key contribution that this book makes.
Yeah,
and I think the other part,
I'll buy that.
I think the other part of it was, and maybe there's two angles of this. One of them was we definitely wanted to try to make some attempts to reach the non-technical executives in companies. The more and more we're seeing security, it is really becoming a company problem. And I think early on, security was an IT issue. It was something that was dealt with at a lower level. And one of the things we want to do is, what we're seeing is, it's a company problem. And it's a company problem that requires all the executives to work together. And the other side of this is that we wanted to try to arm non-technical executives with the foundation, kind of the framework for how to have the conversation with security professionals and the security technologists. So I think that was part of it. And, the other part, Neil, that I think is also important in terms of it's also written with security teams in mind, is that I imagine as part of the writing process, Neil and I talking about, as we were going through this, we were talking about having discussions about, well, in this scenario, what would we have done? Right. And we approached the book from a CISO perspective as well as a CTO perspective. And I think one of the things that I'm really, really hopeful for is that technology teams would get the book and they would actually be able to discuss these different scenarios, whether it was the Target breach or JP Morgan Chase, and just talk about, okay, what happens in this scenario? What should we do? Or based on what would happen here, how are we prepared to handle this? So part of it is, it could be like a great tool for having a dialogue and an invitation just to have this discussion. And I think one of the things I enjoyed the most in the writing process was really having this, and honestly, some debates with Neil about, like, well, I'm not sure I would do that, or that sounds too good for a textbook, but in real life we would do something differently. And I think that's kind of the invitation for that we want the teams, the security team specifically, and the technology teams to have.
No, that's great. I do like how you have some you bring in the real world leadership aspects into play, right? What is the board involved in? What are the leaders doing? So you kind of cover both the technical aspects and you bring in the organizational part of the company into it as well.
Yeah, hey guys, great answer, good summary too. As we're preparing for this podcast, and Paul said, "Hey, you got to read this book," and I get the book, and it's massive, right? I'm like, no, what are you doing to me? But as I started digging in, I was like, this is an actual joy. It's a great book. I actually took a note and I said, this book is literally a one-stop education experience for those interested in cybersecurity, information security. So kudos, great job on that. On that note, did you consider? Yeah, absolutely. Did you consider almost like multiple volumes? Like you're tackling a heck of a lot of information in one book. I mean, is this on the horizon?
So, John, you're by the way, I really appreciated the quote that you put together in summary of the book. And especially given your background in the FBI, having seen a number of these breaches from angles that Moudy and I haven't been as exposed to as being in the roles that we have. I think one of the things that we wanted to do is also just tell the stories. There's a lot that can be learned through stories. And one of the things, Paul, to what you were saying is we have two chapters in the book. There's one chapter in the second half of the book. The first half of the book, of course, focuses on the stories behind all the biggest breaches. But in the second part of the book, there's two chapters, one that speaks to members of the boards of directors and CEOs. And then there's a chapter right after it that speaks to CISOs, CIOs, CTOs, and basically we give them advice for how to talk to each other and how to have this discussion around cybersecurity. So we encourage the board members to focus on some of the higher level aspects. Moudy did a great job in bringing this concept of care into the book, what security controls are consistent, adequate, and so on. And then in the follow-up chapter, we give advice to technologists to focus on stories and then back them up with metrics. So and we encourage both sets of readers to read both of those chapters so they know what to expect from each other when talking about cybersecurity at the board level.
And we did not, to be clear, we did not intend it to be, as we were not solving for making it a large book. I think Neil and I were shocked when the publisher was like, hey, I think it's 400 and something. I'm like, there's got to be a mistake. But ultimately, I was like, okay, I guess that was the case. But really, I think maybe one could argue you're getting two books in one. One is really providing, and I think for anyone who wants an introduction to security, for us to be able to kind of outline some of these major breaches, it's almost like a historical perspective on some of the biggest breaches that impacted, especially in the United States. So there's that kind of, it's now like a kind of like a one place to go and get that grasp, that depth of the understanding. The other part is just kind of a whole other book, really, which is really how do you protect your own organization? So one is learn about all these things, and I love the quote that if history doesn't repeat itself, I think it was Mark Twain who said, if history doesn't repeat itself, it surely rhymes. I might be paraphrasing a little bit, but there's definitely a whole lot of rhyming that as we kind of took this broad view and looked at all these breaches, clearly there is a pattern that happens over and over again. And a part of this, kind of the biggest contribution, I would say, is, hey guys, here are the patterns that we're seeing. Here's what we learned by deciphering and breaking down all these breaches. I think you might want to read this because there may be a pattern here that could actually impact your own organization. And it's not a one size fits all. So part of it is, here are the things that are constantly rhyming. You might want to assess yourself against this and see where are the gaps in your organization and how do we use this as a way to motivate. And again, nothing else, just start the conversation. A lot of it is really around the CISO and the CIO or the CTO really becoming that storyteller, being able to advocate and share the story, not necessarily being fear driven, but be able to share the stories of here's what happened in these large organizations. Some spend hundreds of millions of dollars, and here's what happened. How can we protect ourselves?
When Moudy and I set out to write this book, we were thinking that maybe it should be about a 300-page book. And initially, we were thinking about, okay, maybe 2/3 of the book should be about some of the biggest breaches and the stories and histories behind them. And then the remaining third should provide advice. And initially, what we wanted to do is we just wanted to help get more people into the field. So there's a chapter at the end of the book on how you can apply your skills to get into the field of cybersecurity. You don't have to be a master technical hacker to enter the field of cybersecurity. I think one of the problems is that there's so many other parts of an organization that need to move to achieve security, and that's one of the reasons we need people with more diverse skills. So the other thing that we did is Moudy was great about surveying, his audiences, and I also surveyed some of my audiences. And one thing that those audiences told us was that there is not a book that has cybersecurity lessons for everyone, where everyone includes, people at the board level, at the CEO level, security and technology professionals. We also have advice for investors on where to pour money into cybersecurity going forward. And so when we expanded that scope to really involve everyone is when the book grew. And I think in the initial drafts, maybe it was at 330, 340 pages. And then when the publisher kind of put in the final template, we got back this proof that was 470 some odd pages. We were both surprised. But the hope is that for folks that buy the book, they are to an extent getting two books in one, as Moudy mentioned.
You mentioned, Neil, about kind of the investor community and some of the, it kind of leads me to my question around the security companies that are all trying to help protect all these businesses, right, and governments and things like that. And and the security field is daunting, right? You mentioned people trying to get into the field. I definitely see that. It's sort of there's a lot of crazy acronyms, and I feel like I'm relatively new in sort of working in the security space, and it is daunting for sure. Yeah.
Oh, I was gonna say, it is indeed daunting, and the background behind the chapter on advice to investors, cybersecurity investors, came out of after I finished up my last two CISO gigs at LifeLock and at Symantec's Consumer Business Unit. I spent some time advising Benamou Global Ventures. Eric Benamou is the former CEO at 3Com years ago. And I also spent some time as an executive in residence at Trinity Ventures. And what I did in those experiences, and all this made its way into the chapter, is I analyzed where the $45 billion of investment in cybersecurity to date has gone thus far. And given that there have been so many breaches, it's clear that something is not working. In reviews that Moudy did, we were able to advance the quality of that, but basically we identified that, say, $11 billion has gone into the field of network security. And there's some areas in cybersecurity that are overinvested, there's some that are sufficiently invested, and there's some that are underinvested. So things like Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies and blockchain, there's about 10 billion that's gone into that area, compared to 11 billion for network security, a necessary but not sufficient defense. You carry away, maybe we don't need to invest more. There hasn't been as much that's come out in that area besides Bitcoin. But there's areas like Internet of Things security. There's areas such as cloud security. These areas need more investment. I think IoT security needs more investment than cloud security, but that's pretty much where that chapter came out of.
Yeah, it just seems like basically everybody's on their own to some extent, trying to figure out the best tools, the right things to use for their company, and then best of luck to you. And there's all these there's 3,000 security companies all kind of vying for, for their money and stuff like that. But I don't know. I just feel it just seems a little bit like Wild West, and
Yeah.
It indeed was Wild West. Oh, go ahead, John.
No, I was going to say, I mean, this is, kind of a good segue into another thing that I really liked about the book was your use of analogies. I'm a big fan, right? I mean, it's very relatable, and I think that's good for the audience that you intended this for. I want to dive into that just a little bit. You used the seatbelt analogy at one point, I think early on in the book, and I think the initial challenge with seatbelts, right, was to get the government to regulate the use of seatbelts. So then we did that. Then I think the next challenge became getting people to actually use them, right? And so now we're starting to see these parallels. And then now it's back to the car makers, like how do we engineer and design the best possible seatbelt? So my question, to kind of dig a little bit deeper, is how do you guys translate that to cybersecurity? And kind of to your point, Paul, like we are trying to build a better mousetrap, right? And so, I mean, what are your thoughts on that, like making that parallel?
Sure. Moudy, you want to take that or Shai?
I think I was. I think I would focus on a couple things in my mind. While Paul, you were saying, there's a lot of players. There's definitely a lot in the marketplace, and I certainly, and this is probably one of my biggest ahas from the book process, was that the real principle, and kind of for the listeners of this podcast today, if there's anything I could just say, it's that practice the fundamentals every single day is the best way to go. Okay, there's all the sizzle, there's all these amazing things. Everything has the word AI in it. Everything has the word machine learning in it, all this stuff. But what it comes down to, it for me at least, is it's, if you want to use a basketball analogy or the seatbelt analogy, right? To stick with the seatbelt analogy, it really is about, you could save a lot of lives by just buckling the damn seatbelt every single time, consistently buckling the seatbelt. Right now, could you get fancy in the Mercedes S-Class? The seatbelt comes, it runs by itself, and basically you don't have to pull it yourself. Yeah, because it's like so important that you can't grab it yourself. It grabs it for you. It's like, okay, sure, like do that. But the fundamental thing is just put the seatbelt on. Whether it has a nice fluffy thing in the middle of it, So I think in security, there's many ways there's a lot of tools you can buy. There's a lot of confusion. There's all these things, but the fundamentals that we go into in the book to me like, that's 80 or 90% of the battle, right? And a lot of the breaches we see, there was like one of the fundamentals, you guys. It wasn't like, so in my mind, and this is where I'm curious to see if I can get Neil to disagree with me here on this one. In my mind, I'd rather have a very basic tool that is fully deployed, the team knows how to operate it and run it. I would rather have that much more than some machine learning tool that the team doesn't know how to do it. It's spinning off so much noise that they just ignore it. And they didn't have enough budget. It was so expensive that they can't afford to fully implement it. And it's so complicated that you don't have the right engineering people to run it. For me, I would rather simple. I very much follow the, boring technology. Security needs some good old fashioned boring technology that's consistent, predictable, that just works, that people know how to respond and support it, rather than some fancy thing. Now, some security vendor may not like all of that, but in my mind, like day in and day out, you guys, having that kind of those fundamentals of just practicing that daily is so much more important than something else.
I think getting the basics right is indeed super, super important. And Moudy, I want to return to something that we were talking about earlier with regards to patterns, right? We've analyzed in the book so many mega breaches and 9,000 other reported breaches to date. So whether it was Target, JP Morgan Chase, OPM, Equifax, Yahoo, Capital One, Facebook, whoever was getting breached, between that and the 9,000 other reported breaches, it turned out that there were 6 root causes at the heart of them. And those 6 root causes are phishing, malware, software vulnerabilities, third-party compromise or abuse, unencrypted data, and inadvertent employee mistakes. If you focus on putting in the basic countermeasures to thwart those 6 root causes of breach, you will be in an amazingly better place. Your chances of getting breach will significantly reduce by getting the basics right. To also just talk a little bit about seatbelts, the seatbelt to us seems obvious, straightforward, the most basic thing. I think there was also an evolution over time. It was, if you look at when cars were first invented, to when Volvo introduced the first lap and shoulder seatbelt as we know it today. We have the exact year in the book. I believe it was in the 50s or 60s. But basically, that had to come to fruition. It was first an optional feature on most cars. And it was 10 years after that that federal regulation was put in place saying that you need to wear it. So, what seems basic to us today may have seemed, more complicated, like, well, why would you put the seatbelt? It wasn't even socially acceptable in the 60s and 70s.
I mean, even in the 80s, that's a great point, Neil. I mean, even in the 80s, I remember growing up, it was generally not used that much then.
Yeah,
the car wasn't dinging at you and things like that.
Yeah, it took me months to get my parents to use the seatbelt after I took my driver's ed
I didn't think about it like that. That's almost like 100 years of the car, practically.
So that was a great answer.
Time.
Great
So
answer. My
world's
takeaway.
moving-
Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Neil.
Oh, I was just gonna say the hope is that the world's moving faster today, but you look at the big breaches that are still taking place, and maybe we're still in the midst of discovering what should be the basics.
Right.
So Moudy, I think got me about halfway there towards disagreeing with him.
I really wanted you guys to. I wanted to.
Balanced position.
Yeah,
I wanted to see a fight.
I know. A little virtual Zoom slap fight.
Oh, well,
Yeah,
we
my
had a lot
takeaway
of good debates as we were writing the book, I'll tell you.
I bet.
Yeah, we'll talk to Zoom and get some of those emojis going. My takeaway with all that, Paul, first of all, guys, great answer. And Paul, I think there's an opportunity here for seatbelt automation to Moody's point. So we're going to do it, not you. We're going to make the big bucks with seatbelt automation. So.
There you go.
Yeah.
I had a question about encryption, Neil. You mentioned encryption as one of the things that, I guess, I'm assuming not having things encrypted led to some issues, right? So
yes, absolutely.
Is that, like, whenever I think about encryption, typically, software-based encryption, you turn on, it's sort of like, it's good if you don't have access to the application, right? It's sort of like if you're coming in from the outside and you try to go attack the data, it's encrypted, okay, then it worked. But if you go in through the application, the encryption doesn't really work because you have access to the, you've sort of hacked in through that way or something.
That's
Is
right.
there,
Okay.
I was curious, like, what you found in looking at that. What kinds of encryption does work? Are there some that work better than others as far as how it's set up?
Sure, happy to talk about encryption. So by the way, you're exactly right. If you can take over somebody's account, say through phishing or another form of account takeover, and you have that person's credentials and they have access to the data, the application, the operating system, everything will happily decrypt all of the data and give it to you. And there's been a bunch of breaches like the Anthem breach and whatnot, where database administrator credentials were stolen and the systems happily decrypted all the data for the attackers. So one of the things that I'll mention at a macro level is when we looked at the 9,000 reported breaches, the categorization that, say, privacyrights.org gave, these breaches, if you look at those, phishing and malware seemed like it might be the biggest issue, but there were actually more smaller breaches that happened due to unencrypted data than even phishing or malware. So if you take into account the fact that there's many portable devices that have been lost or stolen, and sometimes there's just media, papers or hard disks where the hard disks got lost or stolen along the way, the number of breaches that happen due to the fact that data was simply not encrypted is actually more than all of the attackers' hacks, at least in the 15, 16 year period that we looked at. So I would encourage CISOs and CTOs and CIOs to just turn on disk level encryption as a very basic thing, whether it be File Vault on Macs, BitLocker on Windows, or just have mobile device management that has people put pins on all their phones. All of that will encrypt the data at a storage layer so that when these things get lost, there is no reportable breach. I will also say, though, that typically, if you look at cloud environments, the storage layer encryption, what it protects against is people stealing disks out of data centers, which happens, but doesn't happen as often as some other root causes of breach. And so for that, you do need to encrypt at the application layer. And from a technical perspective, you should have that application layer encryption done and used by a service account that is not touched by humans. If you want to be as unbreachable as possible. So that's a little bit about encryption.
Yeah, cool. No, thank you for that, Neil.
I think there was a story a few years ago where these big multifunction copiers, where all these copiers, they have hard drives, and basically in the hard drives there was tens of thousands of all the documents, because it was just like a temporary file, and unencrypted, and you could get these copiers basically for free and see all kinds of information about.
Yeah, 'cause it was like basically scanned data, right?
It's all the scanned data. Like you could just
Yep.
And for years and years and years of information that could just be gleaned from the hard drives on those copiers that were being thrown away.
That is a great story. In fact, I think that beyond encryption, the other important thing to do is in security configuration for any such devices, it's better to just not store it, right? If there's a configuration setting where you could just tell the copier, don't store, don't archive all the scans, then if they aren't stored, then they can't be lost or stolen or breached. So there's an important concept of data minimization. Don't store it and you can't get breached.
That sounds like my vet with they won't store my credit card, and every time I have to give it to them, they go, we don't want to store it, and I go, it would be so nice if you did, but
Yeah.
I understand.
My life would be so much
Their life
easier.
would be hell,
Yeah,
probably,
yeah.
storing credit cards.
Exactly. Defer the
Who knows?
hell.
Maybe in 10 or 20 years, when there's more seatbelts, the equivalent of seatbelts deployed out there, then they can be stored, and we can get the convenience and the security. But we're just not there right now.
That'll be after Paul and I do the seatbelt automation venture. So
Yeah.
So one of the breaches of many that you talked about was the Capital One breach, and you noted that you talked quite a bit about an amateur, and I believe her name was Erratic.
That's right.
Yep. Breaching essentially their cloud space. And so now we've got, anybody who has picked up a paper or looked at a website now knows that the nation state threat is significant, right? And it's a real threat. But then you're talking about Erratic, which, I don't know, maybe we'd call that an amateur threat, but still a lot of damage was done. How should companies prepare differently for both Erratic and that nation state sophisticated threat, if that makes sense?
So there's a saying in the security community, and that's attacks only get better. And going back 20 years ago, we had to deal with the lone amateurs that would write worms like Code Red, Nimda, SQL Slander,
Script
kiddies,
exactly. Yep.
reusing all of that, and they'd be very effective. And I think what we've learned in the world is that all those attackers still don't go away, right? We are working on defending against organized cyber criminals. We are working on defending against foreign nation state adversaries, but the amateurs have not gone away. And actually, just looking at the state of cloud security, for a single lone ex-Amazon employee to have leveraged a server-side request forgery vulnerability and a misconfiguration in a web application firewall to single-handedly steal 100 million credit applications probably tells us something about the state of cloud security as compared to a bunch of other areas, right? So I think we need to have probably more defenses in the area of cloud security and more maturity there to just do better against the amateurs, let alone the organized cyber criminals or nation states.
Yeah,
now this is probably where I have some disagreements with Neil, because I think when there's a breach in cloud security, when there's anything related to a cloud security, we immediately hear about it. right? Everybody knows about the S3 bucket that was open to the public and there was some information on it. Okay. I have worked at companies where it's not like the firewalls. Now everybody feels super secure and confident behind firewalls. But I got to tell you, a lot of these firewalls over time, I mean, on day one, these firewalls are perfect and they're clean, they know what access. But over the years, there's a bunch of rules that nobody knows what they're for. And the other aspect of it is oftentimes, there's a lot of times there's errors in the firewall rules. And these rules, what you think you're actually doing is not exactly, the rule is not exactly either. It's applied wrong, it's applied incorrect. I mean, there's just a lot of different things. So I am personally, I probably feel more secure running my workloads in an AWS environment, for example, or in a Google environment. If nothing else, I feel like at least the core foundation, a Google or an Amazon, they can afford a lot more security application engineers than I can inside any company, right? So I have a confidence that the core infrastructure is being protected a lot more than any single company can do. Now, is like a public cloud far more new? And it's one thing, we've been configuring Cisco firewalls forever, to pick on Cisco or picking any of your favorite firewalls. We've been doing that for a very, very long time, right? Clearly, we're still going through the maturity process, but I don't necessarily buy into, by default, that a public cloud would be less secure than a hosted environment. If anything, I think when things happen in a private environment, I don't think it's as noteworthy, and it doesn't create the same level of vibrations that a public cloud does. What do you think of that, Neil?
I do. I think that's great.
What a nice guy.
On that. So,
Now we're getting
I think that whether you're in the cloud or you're on premise, there is a saying, right? It's there's an acronym here, KISS, right? Keep it simple, stupid. And I think whether you're in the cloud or whether you're on premise, if you've got a firewall with thousands of rules, it's going to be very hard for anybody to really understand and reason about its security. So complexity is the enemy of security, irrespective of whether you're in the cloud or you're on premise. Now, where I agree with Moudy is that the cloud providers can invest a lot more in security than most typical on-premise data centers can. And security is one of those areas where if you invest a lot of capital, you do it once, you get it right, we can get to a state where cloud security deployments and especially on the infrastructure side are better. But I think that one of the challenges in the cloud environment is that companies are still responsible for their application level security and above. And you can mess that up just as easily in the cloud as you can on premise. And I think the challenge is that a lot of these cloud environments are newer and there just isn't as much expertise. So we need to have more expertise, and that can help us get to a better state. I do think that if I look at some cloud providers, they do provide more tools and more scanning at the application level than other clouds. So choose your cloud carefully.
And that's also just back to the seatbelt analogy. I think that cloud providers are providing the seatbelt. Are the customers actually putting it on and wearing it and applying it? There's definitely a lot of scanning, like really good scanning tools. They can confirm and see, help you understand your security groups, help you understand, the structure, the overall structure and the architecture. The question is, again, as a customer, you have to take advantage of those tools, run them, and actually do something about them. There's always the problem with, first you got to know the problem, and then it's like, okay, now I know this thing. What am I going to do about it? Do I prioritize it, or do I just kind of keep it, ignore it, or it sits in the backlog?
Yeah, you got to actually go do something about it.
We saw with Target, right? Like you have to, there's things we're firing off in the Target breach. I mean, this is the saddest thing is like you have tools that are actually telling you, hey, I think there's something going on here. And whether it's too much noise, and again, I think we all have those same problems in different environments. But yeah, taking action is really important.
Yeah, Moudy brings a great example. In the Target case, right, they had deployed FireEye. They had paid like $1.6 million for a whole bunch of FireEye sensors just 6 months before they experienced the breach. And those sensors were alerting. Their team in India was seeing a lot of malware binaries. The categorizations were generic, but there were so many alerts and they were lost in enough noise that by the time they got escalated to the US-based team, they just couldn't be acted on fast enough. So I think there's a lot of issues. In addition to quote unquote using the seatbelts, you've got to make sure that the signal that you're getting from it is high fidelity enough. Moudy had made a comment earlier about half invested and half baked security initiatives. What can happen is that if you deploy a security tool and you don't put enough investment into tuning it properly, great, you may actually get a false sense of security because it's deployed, but not in a high fidelity enough of fashion that you can contain attacks that occur and that get actually reported on by the tools.
Yeah, it's not enough to have the technology and to deploy the tool, but you actually have to do something with it, to everybody's point, I believe. So, yeah, understand what it's doing.
I'm curious, Moudy, you kind of mentioned some of these already, but I'm curious if you have any other sort of critical takeaways for IT executives or CTOs sort of related to your work around this book. I mean, you've already talked about some of them, about making sure that you actually go and, deploy the technology, keep it simple, and actually finish what you're doing. Anything else that comes to mind that you might want to share?
I think there's probably, and this is something I've been thinking about, even writing more about. I'll probably post an article or two on LinkedIn. But I think one of the ideas that came across, and it's funny because as we were writing this, the conversation, the collaboration between Neil and I really, really think it's important that CTOs and CISOs in whatever configuration, some organization, one is reporting to the other. There's sometimes their peers, it doesn't matter. But what's really, really important is that the CISO and the CTO or the CIO really have to have a good working relationship. I think a lot of times there's almost an adversarial relationship. At least I have found where we're not necessarily listening to each other, or one is pounding on the table too hard. The other person is not understanding. And in many ways, part of what made this book so much fun to work with Neil on is that we were actually able to have that kind of conversation and again, to be able to debate. And I would encourage people in those roles to make sure that you have a really good working relationship, because without that, I feel like the companies are going to just be screwed, quite frankly, if those two teams and those two functions don't have a good, healthy environment. Doesn't necessarily mean, one always agrees with the other, right? It does mean that there's got to be good push and pull. I think that's really viable. And I think an idea related to that is this idea, and I try to reinforce that in the book, is that, don't fall for the compliance checklist, right? Don't fall for just having a compliance-based security program. You've got to think, in this case, you have to think less like an auditor inside the company and think more like a hacker. Right. And one of the analogies that I love is, when you think about our own history, the American Revolution, right? In our own history, right? You had the redcoats and you had they had the guerrilla warfare tactics, right? And one group stood in lines, right? The British redcoats stood in lines, they were aiming their guns, and these guys were just getting shot at from everywhere. And I think in many ways, companies, if you're just following a compliance-based program, you are basically like a redcoats, right? You're going to stand in line, you look professional, you look organized, you're buttoned down. Okay, but you have your enemy is taking shots at you from behind you. They're hiding behind trees. They're leading you into a ditch and shooting at you. And I think companies really have to have very much a hacker mentality, because with the people you're dealing with, they're not following a freaking checklist, right? The people you're dealing with, they're finding your weakest link. And I think we got to get more organizations to think that way. You're in kind of, this is guerrilla warfare. This is not following a compliance program. So that would be the other vantage point is, this definitely try to focus on the biggest vulnerabilities and the biggest issues that impact you and your organization, as opposed to following something that's just generic and you're just doing it almost in this automatic mode just to keep somebody happy. That would be my other thing, because we're all limited in time, right? We have this limited time and attention, and I would focus more on that. Those would probably be some of my takeaways.
So you're saying the hackers aren't taking any breaks for tea time?
They are not. No.
I got it.
John, I think we have time for maybe one more if you've got.
One
more.
Absolutely. So, early in this discussion, you guys talked about kind of the need for talent in this field. And it was a great call out, and I kind of call it, I always try to come up with a new phrase, like maybe a glut gap, right, for cybersecurity talent. So what can we do, we being society, what can we do to attract that talent, recruit it, educate it, and grow it to basically where everybody could write a book like this?
So if I could take that, given that I serve as co-director of Stanford's Advanced Cybersecurity Program, one of the things that I'll mention is that in our program for years we focused on helping train security professionals and helping them advance their skills. And a couple of years ago, we made a distinct, explicit initiative to help bring more people in the field by creating a Foundations of Information Security course. So I think that what we need to do is we need to bring more people in the field. And so we need to have more conversations. We need to tell more stories. In our Foundations of Information Security course, it starts off with me interviewing Vint Cerf, who was one of the two co-inventors of TCP/IP from way back when. And, I interview him not only on the history of the internet, but the history of security of the internet. And the goal there is to help bring more people into the fold, as we also do in this book by telling the stories of the big breaches. And so I think we need to make the topic more accessible, discuss things with fewer acronyms and less technical jargon, and I think that'll help us advance the field and bring more people into it.
Yeah, almost make it more relatable, more approachable.
Yeah.
To your point, Neil, like kind of accessible. I think that's a great idea. Moody, were you gonna?
And I think we'd also, looking at the SolarWinds attack and what has been happening, I think there almost needs to be a call to action, almost at a national level, that one of the ways we can serve this great country that we love is to help with the cyber defenses. I think there needs to be a kind of a new awakening, because what's been happening, and I think we're definitely not on the leading edge. We're seeing more and more these kinds of attacks having greater and greater impacts. And I think the SolarWinds attack is still, we're still learning more about how severe that is. So there almost needs to be at a national kind of level, a national campaign to raise the awareness. And we definitely need more of that on the government side. We definitely need more on the business, on the private side. I think there's definitely, and hopefully this book is in some way an invitation to whether you love the consumer data and you want to protect people's data, or love our country and you want to protect its information, its assets. I think there's different multiple venues here to help.
And I think there's multiple levels of collaboration. I think one of the reasons that Moudy and I work so well together, and we fought a whole bunch of battles and executed on a whole bunch of security initiatives together back when we worked together at LifeLock. And I think that collaboration is super important to be able to have the intellectual debates, to have them in a fun, humorous way. What was great about working on the book together is that we were able to do that also when there wasn't kind of as much at stake with regards to just getting some chapters written, right? So that worked well. And I think that kind of collaboration needs to extend way beyond what happens within a company. As Moudy was mentioning, we need to have that level of collaboration between government organizations, between private industry. Moudy mentioned the SolarWinds hack. And I think that was, while there have been many third-party compromises before, there have been many foreign nation state attacks that we talk about in the book. What was novel is that there was one third party that was used to get into so many government organizations. So I think there is indeed a higher calling here, and we need to have more collaboration in a way that's conversational without getting bogged down into tools and technologies, but getting focused on the what we're trying to achieve as opposed to how we're trying to achieve it.
Well, let's be clear. Neil is definitely a slave driver, so he did not go easy on me.
One of the interesting things about how CISOs and CIOs and CTOs need to work together is, if you think about a CISO's team, they are like a small group of Jedis. There's no way that they can win the battles without the entire infantry and all the lieutenants and generals, and all the lieutenants, generals, and the full team is typically not owned by the CISO of their organization. So being able to collaborate so that you can come and meet eye to eye on what are the target outcomes is super important. And I think that the CISO's organization also serves as independent verification of how are we doing on security posture, which is one of the advantages in having those roles be peers. But you can accomplish a similar sort of thing, especially the more potentially more mature an organization is. So I'll tell you, while I might have been tough on Moudy, he was, by the way, also pretty tough on me with regards to pushing back. But what are we actually trying to achieve here? I think there's a great point that this should not be about compliance and checking the list. Every CTO, CISO, CIO, they have to comply with PCI and SOX and FedRAMP and all these compliance standards. But I think that one of the learnings from the book is that if we focus on the 6 root causes of breach and putting in place scientifically effective countermeasures for those 6 root causes, that will go much farther than trying to check every single checkbox and dying from a death from 1,000 cuts.
Yeah. Well, Neil, Moudy, we super appreciate you guys coming on today and talking with us. I think, it nice and easy to understand. So I'm hoping that people will be able to walk away with learning a few things about some of the biggest breaches and kind of why you guys, began this journey in the first place. And of course, thank you, John,
thank you for having me, Paul.
Joining and doing all your great homework.
Yeah.
Which is
a lot
super
of
helpful.
reading.
Yeah.
But it was awesome.
But thanks a lot, guys. And
Thanks so
best
much.
luck
Thanks
to you
so
with the
much.
book. And look forward to having you on again sometime.
Appreciate the
guys.
invite.
Thank you, Paul.
It's fun
Thank you,
talking
John.
to you today.
All right.
Great.
Thank you.
See you guys.
Bye, guys.